As World War II progressed and the once mighty Third Reich began to falter, Adolf Hitler increasingly withdrew from the public eye. By the early months of 1945, the charismatic, forceful leader who had once inspired millions had all but vanished. His last significant public speech was delivered on March 23, 1943, in Berlin's historic Zughaus, or Old Armory, during Heroes' Memorial Day, a day set aside to honor the fallen soldiers of both world wars. Even then, the fiery spark that had once captivated his audiences was beginning to fade, as the immense pressures of the war and his deteriorating health took their toll. The assassination attempt on July 20, 1944, marked a dramatic turning point in Hitler's decline. Although he survived the bomb plot, the Führer was left physically and psychologically scarred. In the aftermath, his public appearances became almost non-existent, and he was only occasionally seen in the carefully controlled propaganda films produced by Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's propaganda minister. These films, captured shortly after the attempt on his life, reveal a man who was increasingly stooped, frail, and prematurely aged. The once dominant image of a virile, dynamic leader who embodied the spirit of Nazi Germany was quickly fading, replaced by a figure who seemed to be crumbling under the weight of both the war and his own failing body. Hitler's retreat from public life posed a significant problem for the Nazis. His powerful oratory and commanding presence had been essential in maintaining morale among both the German people and the troops. However, as his physical condition worsened, his appearances were limited to radio addresses, where his infirmities could be hidden from the public. But this strategy had its limits, especially as the war situation grew increasingly desperate. Goebbels, who had become one of Hitler's closest confidants in the final months of the war, recognized the danger of Hitler's growing invisibility. He knew that the people needed to see their leader, even if only to reassure themselves that he was still alive and in command. On January 16, 1945, Hitler arrived back in Berlin aboard his special train, having left his Western Front headquarters, Adlerhorst, for the last time following the failure of the Ardennes offensive. Just 2 days later, on January 18, 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched a massive offensive that shattered the already weakened German defenses on the Eastern Front. As the Soviets surged westward, Hitler's focus shifted entirely to the battle against the Red Army, the greatest threat to his crumbling empire. Initially, Hitler continued to reside in his apartment in the Old Reich Chancellery until mid-February 1945. However, the relentless Allied bombing of Berlin forced him to move into the Führer bunker beneath the garden of the new Reich Chancellery. While he continued to take his meals and hold military situation conferences in the Chancellery itself until mid-March, by that time, he had retreated permanently into the underground bunker, where he would spend the remaining weeks of his life, leading an increasingly isolated and desperate existence. Though the Eastern Front briefly stabilized, it was merely the calm before the storm. Stalin's forces were preparing for their final, decisive push toward Berlin. With the Red Army now just 100 kilometers east of the capital, the German military was desperately trying to patch together a defense. A motley collection of worn-out divisions, severely lacking in armor, artillery, and trained personnel, was all that stood between Berlin and the Soviet juggernaut. Hitler's complete absence from the front lines only fueled rumors that he was already dead, and this absence was becoming a serious problem for the Nazi leadership. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful secretary, had gradually positioned himself as the gatekeeper to the Führer, controlling access to him and, in many ways, shaping the information that reached him. Bormann's influence over Hitler grew as he isolated the dictator from the outside world, confining him to the Reich Chancellery and the Führer bunker. Hitler's only contact with his armies was through twice-daily military situation conferences, where generals and their staffs would report in person. However, for an army on the brink of facing the full might of the Soviet Union, this isolation was profoundly detrimental to morale. Recognizing the urgency of the situation, Goebbels argued that Hitler needed to be seen by the public and the troops. He believed that a visit to the front lines would provide much-needed reassurance that Hitler was still in command and capable of leading the nation in its darkest hour. However, Hitler was initially resistant to the idea. After the bomb plot, he had become increasingly paranoid about his personal safety, and Bormann, along with many of Hitler's inner circle and generals, tried to dissuade him from making such a dangerous move. The Eastern Front was relatively quiet as the Soviets prepared for their final assault, but Allied aircraft dominated the skies over Germany, often attacking vehicles on the roads at will. The generals likely understood that Hitler's appearance might do more harm than good, further damaging the already fragile morale of the troops. Despite these concerns, Goebbels' persistence paid off, and Hitler eventually agreed to the visit. The location selected was a command post not too far from Berlin, the headquarters of the 9th Army's 101st Army Corps, situated at Monschau Castle in Harnkopf, approximately 60 kilometers from the Reich Chancellery and just 20 kilometers behind the German front lines on the Oder River. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a 90-minute drive, but bomb damage to the roads, particularly in Berlin and its suburbs, meant the journey took longer. For the trip, Hitler chose not to use his usual 4.5-ton armored Mercedes-Benz 770K limousine. Instead, he likely rode in one of his Mercedes-Benz W31 six-wheel command cars, with the soft top-up, driven by his longtime personal chauffeur, SS Lieutenant Colonel Erich Kempke. Hitler was accompanied by a convoy of W31s from the Reich Chancellery motor pool, carrying aides and heavily armed bodyguards. The large column of vehicles departed from the Reich Chancellery at noon on March 3, 1945. Hitler's doctors had prepared him for the journey by administering stimulants to help him endure the strain of the public appearance. Dressed in his familiar field gray tunic, with a long gray leather trench coat and his distinctive leader's hat, Hitler also wore field gray breeches and high black leather jackboots, a departure from his usual black trousers and shoes. This was an important image. He needed to look like the war leader who had been photographed in Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, not the frail, aging man he had become. Upon arriving at Monschau Castle, Hitler was met by the commander of the 9th Army, General Theodor Bussy, and the commander of the 101st Corps, Generalleutnant Friedrich Zickwolf, along with a host of other generals and staff officers. Outside, a large contingent of ordinary soldiers had gathered, eager to see their Führer. Inside the castle, Hitler was filmed greeting junior officers of the 9th Army. The cameraman from the propaganda ministry took great care to shoot him in a way that concealed his physical ailments, but certain things were impossible to hide. Hitler's bent posture and shuffling gait were all too apparent, as was his fixed, almost vacant expression. Despite the cameraman's efforts, Hitler's severely shaking left hand, a clear sign of his worsening neurological disorder, was visible in the footage, flapping uncontrollably at his side. This was not the image of the indomitable leader that the Nazis wanted to project. The situation conference that followed saw Hitler seated at a table covered with maps, as General Bussy and the other officers listened to his increasingly delusional pronouncements. Hitler implored the 9th Army to hold the line for as long as possible, promising that new, wonder weapons, would soon be unleashed in sufficient numbers to turn the tide of the war. However, it was clear to those present that these were the desperate ramblings of a man who was losing his grip on reality. After the conference, Hitler was photographed and filmed leaving the castle, walking briskly past rows of saluting soldiers to his waiting car. He made a visible effort to project an air of vigor and determination, but those who saw him up close could not help but notice the strain etched into his features. His driver, Kempke, later recalled that once Hitler had settled into the front passenger seat for the return journey, he appeared deep in thought, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on him. He did not speak for the entire ride back to Berlin. Upon his return to the Reich Chancellery, Hitler resumed his isolated existence in the Führer bunker. Apart from two brief appearances, one on March 20, 1945, when he met with Hitler Youth members in the garden outside his bunker, and another on April 20, 1945, his 56th and final birthday, in the honor court of the new Reich Chancellery, the German people never saw Hitler in public again. These were the final days of a dictator whose once unassailable power had crumbled along with the empire he had sought to build.